Lyndon Johnson was gambling his political career that American military power would convince Ho Chi Minh to abandon support for the Viet Cong. Instead, Ho prepared his people for the long fight. They may bring in 500,000 troops, 1 million, or even more. If the war lasts 10, 20 years or longer, the Vietnamese people will not be intimidated. Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. Through 1964, ground combat took place only in South Vietnam between Southern combatants, the American-backed South Vietnamese Army against the Communist-backed Viet Cong. But as American troops poured into Vietnam in 1965, Hanoi ordered troops of the North Vietnamese Army to begin infiltrating to the south. By late summer, they were massed in the Ia Drang Valley near Pleiku. The U.S. Army Sky Rangers, the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile, were sent to confront the enemy and block their advance. It was the first time large units were pitched into action by helicopter. The rival armies clashed at the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965. The firefight spanned 4 days and influenced the strategy for much of the war that followed. The combination of American air mobility and massive firepower killed more than 2,000 communist fighters, 10 times the number of Americans who fell. This favorable kill ratio convinced America's commanding general, William Westmoreland, that he could fight and win a war of attrition by grinding away at the enemy until he surrendered. Despite their losses, the North Vietnamese Army did not view Ia Drang as a defeat. From the experience, they adapted their strategy to avoid large-scale confrontations and build on the techniques of guerrilla warfare they had employed for centuries, engaging the enemy at close range by surprise when possible, and then fleeing before air and artillery support could be called in. As the United States went to war, officials maintained it was a battle for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. But General Westmoreland's war of attrition was pure muscle. For 3 years, the American war machine unleashed massive destruction on Vietnam. Operations with aggressive names like Search and Destroy targeted suspected enemy strongholds. Others were less discriminate. Vast areas of South Vietnam were turned into free fire zones, destroyed with chemical crop defoliants such as Agent Orange, or simply leveled. The campaigns inflicted enormous casualties on the enemy, but innocent South Vietnamese were caught in the crossfire and suffered horribly. They lived in constant fear of widespread bombing. Herbicides poisoned their children, livestock, and crops. They were forced from homes and watched as their villages were destroyed. One soldier expressed the futility of the American strategy. If they weren't pro-VC when we got here, they sure were when we left. U.S. officials used the growing body count as proof that it was winning the war. But the numbers told only part of the story. The enemy was able to withstand ghastly losses and rebuild to fight again. There was a seemingly endless number of willing recruits eager to join the fight. Many came from North Vietnam by way of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This web of supply routes snaked through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. The trail was the target of daily American bombing. But at night, women and children emerged to repair the damage. During the French War, it had been little more than a footpath. But by the mid-1960s, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a major artery for troops and supplies traveling south into the war zone. General Westmoreland was forced to ask the president for more and more reinforcements, just to keep pace with the enemy. By late 1967, there were nearly 500,000 American combat personnel in Vietnam. But Westmoreland's war of attrition, which had failed to grind down the communists, was exhausting his own troops and slowly wearing away at the patience of the American people. At President Johnson's urging, Westmoreland painted a different picture.
In 1968, a new phase is now starting. We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view.
The end of the war was, in fact, nowhere in sight. Even as Westmoreland spoke, the enemy was preparing for an epic offensive against the government and army of South Vietnam, designed to deal a knockout blow, regardless of the cost.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
Lyndon Johnson had prepared his entire political life to fight the war against America's social ills. He called his sweeping vision the Great Society.
It will not be a short or easy struggle, but we shall not rest until that war is won.
But from the very beginning, the president was torn between the Great Society and his other war, Vietnam. If I left the woman I loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved with that war on the other side of the world, then I would lose everything at home. But if I let the communists take over South Vietnam, then I would be seen as a coward and my nation as an appeaser, and we would both find it impossible to accomplish anything, anywhere, on the entire globe. By an overwhelming margin, Americans stood behind the president in 1964. They backed his social programs and America's continued involvement in Vietnam. Domestic opposition to the war was limited to campus demonstrations and teach-ins.
I think we should stop letting President Johnson fight an armchair war from the White House and turn it over to our generals in Vietnam who know how to fight a war.
Life magazine voiced the support shared by many major news media at the time. The war is worth winning, they said. Victory is within sight. But within 2 years, attitudes had changed. There was a widening gap between official U.S. statements of progress and the dismal facts on the ground. Many called it a credibility gap. In 1967, Life conceded that America had gone into Vietnam for honorable and sensible purposes. But the undertaking had proven harder, longer, more complicated than anticipated. The war was no longer worth winning. It was no longer something to ask young Americans to die for. That sentiment echoed in major cities across the country. As more and more Americans died in Vietnam, the anti-war movement gathered momentum and expanded. In 1967, nearly 500,000 people gathered in New York's Central Park. 75,000 demonstrated in San Francisco. 50,000 marched from Washington to Arlington, determined to shut down the Pentagon. Young men burned their draft cards. Others vilified the president.
Not only are we bleeding our men, having them die in Vietnam, we are spending at the rate of about $30 billion a year. Now that's more than we spend on our entire housing program. It's more than we spend on our entire poverty program in a year.
President Johnson initially believed the nation could afford to fight the war in Vietnam and support the social programs of the Great Society. But as the cost of both escalated it was simply not sustainable. Taxes rose, inflation soared, the economy faltered. The president was forced to scale back the Great Society to pay for Vietnam. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had rallied support for Johnson's domestic agenda, condemned the injustices he saw.
The bombs in Vietnam exploded home. They destroyed the dream and possibility for a decent America. It is estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill in Vietnam, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor.
Until the president stands up and says we're bringing all of the troops home as quickly as we can bring them home, we're bringing them home now, I think the anti-war sentiment in the country will continue to grow. We have to bring them home, and we have to bring them home immediately.
Opposition to the war did grow among Americans from all walks of life. But at the same time, the anti-war movement merged with the counterculture of the 1960s. It became fragmented and militant.
Because the Democratic Party has blood on its hands.
Long-haired hippies represented what middle-class America despised: sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
It's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. There ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die.
Even as the war became increasingly unpopular, Americans still feared the menace of communism.
But ending the conflict is not so simple as just calling it off and coming home, because the price for that kind of peace could be 1,000 years of darkness for generations yet unborn.
Can you imagine a protester in Hanoi, how far he'd get if he wanted to protest North Vietnam sending troops into South Vietnam or into Laos or Cambodia? He'd end up in a jug.
By 1968, America was more divided than at any time since the Civil War. And it was about to get much, much worse.